The apartment was cold when I got home. Not freezing, the radiator worked well enough, but that persistent December cold that settles into corners and door frames, the kind you can feel even through a sweater. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of someone's television through the wall. It was the 18th of December. A Thursday. I hadn't put up any decorations. There was a small artificial tree in a box somewhere in the closet, inherited from a roommate years ago, but I couldn't remember the last time I'd bothered with it. The holidays had a way of feeling optional when you lived alone, when there was no one expecting you to perform the rituals of the season. I made coffee even though it was past 8, because I wanted something warm to hold. The kitchen light flickered twice before steadying. I kept meaning to replace it. Through the window above the sink, I could see the neighbors' lights, white and blue LEDs wrapped around their porch railing. They'd had them up since Thanksgiving. Tasteful. Restrained. The kind of decorating that says, we celebrate, but we are not excessive about it. I wasn't hungry, but I opened the refrigerator anyway. Looked at the same containers I'd looked at that morning. Closed it. Checked my phone. Nothing important. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed. The mail was still sitting on the small table by the door where I dropped it without looking. Mostly junk, probably. A few bills I already paid online. Maybe a Christmas card from my dentist's office with a stock photo of a snowman and a printed signature. I picked up the pile while the coffee finished brewing. Electric bill. Yes. Credit card offer. Recycling. A catalog for furniture I couldn't afford and wouldn't buy. And then? The envelope was cream-colored, slightly yellowed at the edges. Handwritten address. My name and apartment number in careful, deliberate letters. The penmanship was unmistakable, that old-fashioned cursive they don't teach anymore, each letter fully formed, the capitals elaborate without being showy. I knew the handwriting before I looked at the return address. Before I saw the postmark. My hand was shaking. Just slightly. Just enough that the envelope trembled. The postmark read December 22nd. 2 years ago. I set down the rest of the mail. The coffee maker beeped, finished, ignored. I stood in the narrow hallway between my kitchen and living room, holding the envelope in both hands now, staring at my own name written in my grandfather's handwriting. He'd been dead for 20 months. The envelope was thin. Just a card, probably. Not a letter. I could feel the shape of it through the paper, a standard greeting card, maybe with a folded piece of paper inside. The flap was sealed carefully, the kind of seal that meant he'd licked it himself, pressed it down with his thumb to make sure it held. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I was trying to understand how this was possible. Lost in the mail for 2 years. Stuck in a sorting facility, maybe. Fallen behind something. Misrouted and rerouted. It happened. The postal service moved millions of pieces of mail every day. Sometimes things got lost. Sometimes they found their way eventually. But that didn't explain the feeling spreading through my chest. That tight, complicated knot of something that wasn't quite grief because I'd already grieved, and wasn't quite relief because he was still gone, and wasn't quite joy because how could it be? I turned the envelope over. No other markings. No explanation. Just his handwriting and a postmark from 2 Decembers ago, when he was still alive, when he still lived in the house on Maple Street, when I could have called him any evening and heard his voice. The apartment was very quiet. I carried the envelope to the couch and sat down, still holding it with both hands. The coffee sat forgotten in the kitchen, cooling. Outside, someone laughed, a bright, sharp sound that faded quickly into the winter air. I wasn't sure I was ready to open it. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. But it was here now, real and solid and impossibly present, and I couldn't unknow that it existed. Couldn't put it away and pretend I hadn't seen my name in his handwriting, hadn't felt the slight weight of whatever message he'd wanted to send me that last Christmas. I set it on the coffee table in front of me. Looked at it there, cream-colored against the dark wood. My name. His hand. Outside, the December night settled deeper. The neighbor's lights glowed steady through my window. The radiator clicked and hummed. And I sat there, alone, with a Christmas card from a dead man, trying to decide if I had the courage to see what he'd written. I was 7 when I moved into his house. Not temporarily. Not for a visit. Just moved in, with my clothes in garbage bags because we didn't have suitcases, and a showbox of toys I'd chosen from the pile in my old room. My mother drove me there. I remember that. It was raining, and the windshield wipers made a rhythmic squeak that filled the silence between us. She didn't explain much. Said I'd be staying with Grandpa for a while. Said it was better this way. Said she'd call. She didn't call. My father was already gone by then. Not dead, just gone. He'd been gone in the ways that mattered even before he left physically, and I was too young to understand the difference between a parent who was absent and a parent who was present but unavailable. They both felt the same from where I stood. Grandpa was waiting on the porch when we pulled up. I remember his cardigan, grey, with wooden buttons, and the way he didn't rush down the steps. He let my mother bring me to him. Took the garbage bags from her hands without comment, without judgment in his face. Looked down at me with steady eyes and said, "You hungry, James?" I nodded. "Got soup on the stove," he said. "You like tomato?" My mother left before I finished eating. I heard the car start from the kitchen table, heard the tires on the wet driveway. Grandpa was at the sink, rinsing the pot, and he didn't turn around. Just said, "When you're done, I'll show you your room. Used to be your uncle's, but he doesn't need it anymore." That was it. No big speeches. No promises. No awkward reassurances that everything would be okay. Just, "You're here now. There's soup. Here's your room." The room had a twin bed with a blue quilt and a window that looked out at the backyard. There was a dresser with all the drawers empty, waiting. A small bookshelf with some old Hardy Boys novels and a collection of National Geographics. A lamp on the nightstand that had a brass base shaped like a sailing ship. "You can change anything you want," he said, standing in the doorway. "Paint it, rearrange it. It's yours now." I didn't change anything. I liked it exactly as it was. He worked at the hardware store in town. Left every morning at 7:30, came home at 5:15. You could set your watch by him. Before school, he'd make breakfast, nothing fancy, usually cereal or oatmeal, toast with butter, and we'd eat together at the kitchen table without the radio on. Just the sound of spoons against bowls, the scrape of a knife spreading jam. Sometimes he'd ask about school. What I was learning. If I liked my teacher. He'd listen to my answers with full attention, nodding, asking follow-up questions that showed he actually heard me. "What's your favorite subject?" he asked once, when I was maybe 8 or 9. "Reading," I said. "What are you reading now?" I told him about Island of the Blue Dolphins. He asked what it was about, and I tried to explain, getting tangled in the details, and he listened to all of it. The next week, there was a new book on my nightstand. Julie of the Wolves. He never mentioned putting it there. That was how he showed love. Not with declarations. With small, consistent acts of noticing. My mother would call occasionally. Every few months, maybe. Usually late at night, her voice thin and apologetic. She'd promised to visit soon. To get her situation figured out. To make things right. Grandpa would hand me the phone without comment. Sit in his chair across the room with the newspaper, giving me privacy but staying close enough that I wasn't alone with her promises. After I hung up, he'd look up from the paper and say something like, "Need anything from the store tomorrow?" Or "Think it'll rain?" Normal things. Grounding things. He never badmouthed her. Never said, "She's not coming," or "Don't get your hopes up." Never made me feel foolish for believing her. But he also never pretended. Never said, "I'm sure she'll visit soon." Never made promises on her behalf. He just stayed. Solid. Present. Every morning at breakfast, every evening at dinner, every Sunday doing the crossword at the kitchen table. My father sent a birthday card once. I was 10. It had money in it, a $20 bill, and a generic message about being a good kid. The return address was from 3 states away. I showed it to Grandpa, unsure what I was supposed to feel. He looked at it for a moment. "That's nice of him," he said. Neutral. Not bitter. Not dismissive. Just, neutral. Should I write back? I asked. "Do you want to?" I thought about it. Shook my head. "Okay," he said, and that was the end of it. The card went in a drawer somewhere. The money went toward a new bike. He taught me things without making them feel like lessons. How to change a car's oil. How to patch a hole in drywall. How to cook more than just cereal and sandwiches, real things, like roast chicken and mashed potatoes and green beans that didn't come from a can. "If you can read," he said once, while I was struggling with a recipe, "you can cook. It's just following instructions. What if I mess it up? Then we eat it anyway, and you know what not to do next time." We ate a lot of overcooked chicken and undersalted vegetables those first few years. He never complained. Just added more salt at the table and said, "Better than last time." By the time I was 15, I could make a decent meal. By 17, I was better at it than he was. He bragged about it to his friends at the hardware store. I know because one of them mentioned it once when I stopped by after school. "Your grandpa says you're quite the chef." I wasn't. But he thought I was. High school was hard in the way high school is hard when you're living with your grandfather instead of your parents, when you don't have the right shoes or the right stories about family vacations. When teacher-parent night means your grandfather shows up in his hardware store uniform because he came straight from work. I was embarrassed sometimes. Wished he'd dress differently, talk differently. Wished I had a normal family configuration to list on school forms. He never seemed embarrassed by me. Not when I went through a phase of dyeing my hair. Not when I got suspended for fighting. Not when I brought home a report card with more CS than BS. He'd look at the report card, nod, and say, "You working as hard as you can?" Sometimes I'd lie and say yes. Sometimes I'd admit I wasn't. If I said yes, he'd say, "Then that's all anyone can ask." If I said no, he'd say, "Well, something to think about." No lectures. No guilt trips. Just space to be honest, and space to do better if I wanted to. I think of him whenever I do small things. Washing dishes. Folding laundry. Changing the oil in my car even though I could pay someone to do it. I think of him when I'm patient when I don't want to be. When I listen fully instead of waiting to talk. When I show up on time because I said I would. All the small architectures of being reliable, I learned them from him. My mother eventually stopped calling. Just faded out of contact somewhere in my 20s. I heard through an aunt that she'd moved to Arizona, that she was doing better, that she thought about me often. Maybe she did. I don't know. My father I never heard from again after that one birthday card. For all I know, he could be dead. Could be alive and well. Could have a whole other family somewhere who knows him better than I ever did. It doesn't hurt the way it used to. That's something Grandpa taught me too, though not with words. That you can accept absence without letting it define you. That the people who stayed matter more than the people who left. I moved out when I was 22. Got an apartment closer to work, started building what I thought was an adult life. Visited him every Sunday for a while, then every other Sunday, then monthly. He never made me feel guilty about the spacing. Never said, "You never visit anymore." Just seemed genuinely happy when I did show up, asked about my life, fed me too much food. The last time I saw him, I didn't know it was the last time. That's how it always is, I suppose. If we knew, we'd say different things. Stay longer. Pay more attention. It was just a regular visit. We had lunch. Talked about nothing important. I left saying I'd see him next month. He died 3 weeks later. Heart attack. Quick, they said. Didn't suffer. There was a funeral. People from the hardware store came. Neighbors. Some family I barely knew. They all had stories about him, small kindnesses he'd done, help he'd offered. I listened and realized that the steadiness he'd given me, he'd given to everyone. It wasn't special. It was just who he was. And somehow that made it more meaningful, not less. I was still sitting on the couch. The envelope was still on the coffee table. My hands were empty now, resting on my knees. The apartment was darker. I hadn't turned on any other lights. Just the one lamp in the corner, casting everything in warm shadow. I could open it. Should open it. He'd written it for me, after all. Addressed it carefully, sealed it, sent it. But once I opened it, that would be it. The last new thing from him. The last words I hadn't already heard. And I wasn't ready for there to be nothing else coming. Even if it had taken 2 years to arrive. Even if it was already 2 years too late. I left it there on the table and went to the kitchen, finally, to pour the coffee that had long since gone cold. I opened it at 11:30. I don't know what changed. Maybe nothing. Maybe I just reached the point where not knowing became harder than knowing. I sat back down on the couch, picked up the envelope, and slid my finger under the flap. It opened easily, the glue weakened by time. The card inside was simple. A watercolor painting of a cardinal on a snow-covered branch. Not religious, not Santa Claus, not aggressively cheerful. Just a red bird in winter. Clean. Quiet. I opened it. His handwriting filled the inside of the card, not the pre-printed message, which said something generic about warmth and joy, but the blank space beside it and below it. He'd written in blue pen, the ink slightly faded but still legible. Still unmistakably his. James. Merry Christmas. Hope this finds you well. I'm writing this earlier than usual because I've been thinking about things lately and wanted to make sure I got this in the mail on time for once. I stopped. Read it again. For once. As if he'd ever been late with a card. He never was. Every birthday, every Christmas, exactly on time. My throat felt tight. I'm not good at saying things face to face. Never have been. Your grandmother used to get frustrated with me about that, said I kept too much inside. She was probably right. But I'm trying now, even if it's on paper. I remembered my grandmother, though barely. She died when I was 5. There were photos of her around his house, on the mantel, on his nightstand. He kept them there until he died. Never took them down, never moved on to someone else. Once, when I was maybe 13, I'd asked him if he ever got lonely. He'd thought about it for a while. Sometimes, he'd said. But lonely and alone aren't the same thing. I've got a good life. Got you. But don't you miss her? I'd pressed, with the casual cruelty of adolescence. Every day, he'd said simply. But that doesn't mean I'm not grateful for what I had. I want you to know that raising you has been one of the great privileges of my life. I know that might sound strange, privilege. Like I did you a favor. But that's not what I mean. I mean that I got to know you. Got to watch you grow up. Got to be there for the everyday parts. That's not a burden. That's a gift. I had to stop reading. Put the card down on my lap for a moment and breathe. He'd never said that. Not out loud. I'd known he loved me, or I thought I had, but in the same way you know anything that's never spoken. An assumption. A hope. But this. Written down. Deliberate. I know things weren't easy for you. I know you wished sometimes that your situation was different. Normal, maybe. I saw it in your face sometimes when you were younger, that looked like you were embarrassed or wished you could explain me differently to your friends. God. He'd seen that. I thought I'd hidden it better. I don't blame you for that. Kids should have their parents. That's the natural way. And I'm sorry yours couldn't be what you needed them to be. Not because they're bad people, I don't think that. But because everyone has their own struggles, and sometimes those struggles mean they can't show up the way they should. That was so like him. Even now, even in a private letter to me, he couldn't bring himself to speak harshly about my mother, his own daughter. Couldn't condemn my father, even though the man had earned it. I remembered being 16, angry at both of them for something I can't even recall now. Shouting in the kitchen about how they'd abandoned me, how they were selfish, how I hated them. Grandpa had let me finish. Hadn't interrupted. Hadn't told me I was wrong to feel it. Then he'd said, quietly, "You're allowed to be angry. Anger is honest. But try not to let it be the only thing you feel. People are more complicated than their worst choices." At 16, I'd thought that was bullshit. Excuses. Now, at 31, I understood what he'd been doing. Making space for me to be angry without teaching me to stay that way forever. What I want to say is this: you're a good man. You've worked hard to be one, and I see that. I see how you think about things, how you try to be fair, how you show up even when it's difficult. Those aren't small things. Those are the things that matter. My vision was blurring. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. Don't be too hard on yourself about where you've been or what you've done or haven't done. Everyone's figuring it out as they go. Everyone's carrying something. The trick isn't to have it all together. The trick is to keep going anyway. I was 24 when I lost my first real job. Got laid off during a round of cuts, and it felt like proof of something I'd always suspected, that I wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't the kind of person who succeeded. I'd driven to his house without calling first. Sat at his kitchen table while he made coffee. "I don't know what I'm doing," I'd said. "Everyone else seems to have a plan. A career. And I'm just what? Lost." He'd set the coffee in front of me. Sat down across from me. "James, nobody has it figured out. They just look like they do. You think I planned to work at a hardware store for 40 years? You think that was the dream? Wasn't it? The dream was to eat regular. To pay the mortgage. To raise my kids and help my grandson. To have enough left over for a fishing trip once in a while. I did all that. So yeah, I guess it was." He'd stirred his coffee. "Point is, you're doing fine. You'll find another job. You'll keep going. That's what people do. What if I'm not good at anything? You're good at a lot of things. You just don't give yourself credit. You're going to have hard times. Everyone does. When they come, remember that hard times are just times. They're not forever. They're not evidence that you've failed or that you're not enough. They're just part of it." The card was blurring now. I could barely read the words. Be kind to yourself. That's the thing I wish I'd learned earlier. Be as patient with yourself as you'd be with someone you love. You deserve that. I thought about all the times I'd beaten myself up for small failures. Missed opportunities. Things I'd said wrong. Ways I'd disappointed people. The endless litany of self-criticism that ran through my head like background noise. He'd never talked that way. Not about himself, not about me. He just kept showing up, kept doing the next right thing, kept being steady. I'd always thought that was just who he was. Natural. Easy. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe he'd had to learn it too. And remember that you're not alone, even when it feels like you are. You've got people who care about you. Let them. Don't make the mistake of thinking you have to carry everything by yourself. The last line was harder to read, his handwriting slightly shakier, as if he'd been tired. "I'm proud of you, James. I always have been. I hope you know that." I had to stop. Couldn't read any further. The card was still open in my hands, but I couldn't look at it anymore. I set it down carefully on the coffee table, my hands shaking. Outside, the world continued. Cars passed on the street. The neighbors' lights glowed. Somewhere, someone was having a normal Thursday night in December. And I sat in my dim living room, broken open by words written 2 years ago by a man who tried to tell me, one last time, that I was enough. I didn't cry right away. I just sat there, staring at the card on the table, at his handwriting, at the careful way he'd formed each letter. The way the lines weren't quite straight because he'd written it freehand, without guidelines. The way some words were pressed darker than others, as if he'd paused there, thinking about what to say next. The clock on the wall ticked. The refrigerator hummed. My neighbor's television murmured through the shared wall, some late-night show with canned laughter. I picked up the card again. Looked at the cardinal on the front. Red against white snow. Simple. Clean. He would have chosen it carefully. Would have stood in the card aisle at the drugstore, reading through them until he found one that felt right. Not too sentimental. Not too plain. Just appropriate. He'd done that every year. Every birthday, every Christmas. Found a card, written a message, mailed it on time. How many cards had I sent him? The thought arrived quietly, but it landed like a stone in still water. How many times had I called just to talk, no reason, just to hear his voice? How many times had I told him I loved him? I could count them. The number wasn't 0, but it was close enough to 0 that it felt the same. The last Christmas he was alive, I'd sent a card. Late. I remembered that now. Had meant to mail it earlier but got busy with work, with holiday parties I didn't really want to attend, with the general chaos of December. I'd scrawled something quick inside. Merry Christmas, Grandpa. Hope you're doing well. I'll try to visit soon. Love, James. Generic. Rushed. The kind of message you write when you're checking a box rather than actually communicating. He would have received it. Would have propped it up on the kitchen table, probably, next to the salt and pepper shakers. Would have looked at it while he ate his breakfast, alone in the house on Maple Street. Had he wished I'd written more? Had he felt the thinness of it, the way I'd clearly dashed it off without thought? Or had he just been grateful to receive anything at all? I didn't know. Would never know. There were so many things I'd meant to ask him. Things I'd always assumed there would be time for later. What was it like when my grandmother died? Not the facts, I knew those, but the actual experience of it. The grief. How he'd survived it. What did he really think about my mother, his daughter? Did he lie awake at night wondering what he'd done wrong, how she'd ended up the way she was? Did he ever regret taking me in? Was there ever a moment when he'd thought, I'm too old for this. I've already raised my kids. This isn't fair. Had he been scared when he started feeling sick, those last few weeks? Had he known something was wrong? Did he die thinking about me? I would never know any of it. The door was closed. The conversation over. I treated our relationship like it was infinite. Like there would always be next Sunday, next month, next year. Like I could delay the important talks indefinitely because he would always be there, steady and patient, waiting for me to be ready. But here's the thing I was starting to understand, sitting in the dark with his card in my hands, he hadn't waited. He hadn't delayed. He'd said the things that mattered. Maybe not out loud, not in the ways I'd needed to hear them in the moment, but he'd said them. Through his actions. Through showing up, every single day. Through making breakfast and teaching me to change oil and letting me be angry without making me feel guilty for it. And then, at the end, when he'd felt time running short, even if he didn't know exactly how short, he'd written it all down. Made sure I'd know. I'm proud of you. You're a good man. Raising you was a privilege. He'd said it. I just hadn't been there to hear it when he'd needed to say it. But he'd sent it anyway. Had faith that it would reach me eventually. And it had. 2 years late. But here. I thought about all the visits I'd cut short because I had somewhere else to be. All the phone calls I'd let go to voicemail because I was tired or busy or just didn't feel like talking. I thought about the time he'd mentioned wanting to go fishing, and I'd said maybe next month, and next month had turned into never. I thought about his birthday, 2 months before he died. I'd sent a card, on time that year, but I hadn't visited. Had meant to. Had thought about making the drive. But it was a Tuesday, and I had work the next morning, and it seemed easier to just call. We'd talked for maybe 10 minutes. He'd sounded tired but had said he was fine. Had asked about my job, my apartment, if I was eating enough vegetables. I'm good, Grandpa, I'd said. Really? You don't have to worry about me. I don't worry, he'd said. I just wonder. There's a difference. I'd laughed. What's the difference? Worrying is when you think something's wrong. Wondering is when you just want to know how someone is. Well, I'm fine. Same as always. Good, he'd said. That's good. We'd said goodbye. I love you. Love you too. Talk soon. 3 weeks later, he was gone. The regrets sat in my chest like stones. Heavy. Unmovable. But underneath them, something else was emerging. Something I couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't forgiveness. I didn't know if I could forgive myself for all the ways I'd failed to show up. But maybe it was understanding. I thought about what he'd written. Be as patient with yourself as you'd be with someone you love. If someone else told me this story, told me about a grandson who visited when he could, who called on birthdays, who'd done his best even if it wasn't perfect, what would I say? I wouldn't say, you didn't do enough. You should have visited more. You should have called every day. I'd say, you were living your life. That's what he wanted. He knew you loved him. Would I say that? I didn't know. But I thought Grandpa would. I looked around my apartment. The dim lamp in the corner. The empty coffee mug on the end table. The jacket thrown over the back of the chair. The stack of mail I still hadn't sorted. Small pieces of a life. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would seem significant if you were just passing through. But these were the pieces he'd taught me to value. The everyday maintenance. The showing up. The small disciplines that held everything together. I'd learned to pay my bills on time because of him. To change my air filters. To call the landlord when something broke instead of ignoring it. To keep my word when I said I'd do something. I'd learned to listen when people talked. To ask follow-up questions. To be present instead of waiting for my turn to speak. I'd learned that you don't have to be perfect to be good. That trying matters. That showing up, even imperfectly, even late, counts for something. He taught me all of that. Not through lectures. Not through lessons. Just through being who he was, day after day, year after year. I'd spent so much time thinking about what I hadn't given him. All the visits I'd missed. All the conversations we'd never had. But what had he given me? Everything. He'd given me a childhood. Stability. Safety. 3 meals a day and clean clothes and a room that was mine. He'd given me patience when I was difficult. Space when I needed it. Boundaries when I pushed too far. He'd given me a model for what it meant to be decent. Reliable. Kind without making a show of it. He'd given me himself, every single day, for 15 years. And then, even after I'd moved out, even as I'd visited less and called less and gradually drifted into my own life, he'd continued to be there. Steady. Unchanging. A fixed point I could return to whenever I needed to remember what mattered. And at the end, when he must have known, or at least suspected, that time was running short, he'd sat down and written out everything he wanted me to know. Not in anger. Not in disappointment. Not to make me feel guilty. Just to tell me he was proud of me. That I was enough. That I wasn't alone. The tears came then. Finally. Quietly. I sat on the couch in my dim apartment, holding a Christmas card from a dead man, and cried for everything I'd lost and everything I'd been given and the impossible weight of being loved so completely by someone I'd never learned to tell how much he mattered. But I was beginning to suspect he'd known anyway. Maybe not perfectly. Maybe not as much as I wished he had. But enough. The clock ticked. The neighbor's TV fell silent. The December night settled deeper around the building. I wiped my eyes. Looked at the card again. At his handwriting. At the words he'd chosen so carefully. And I thought, he sent this knowing I might not get it. Knowing the mail could lose it, knowing I might have moved, knowing anything could happen. But he sent it anyway. Because that's what love is. Not the certainty of arrival. Just the act of sending. The act of trying to reach someone, even across impossible distances. Even across death.